international security, focusing on non-proliferation nuclear weapons in the post-war period. But again, John, like Chris, is going to take a deeper historical view here, bring things back and look at the connections that we might see with what's going on with Woodrow Wilson, a man who was raised in the first lecture. Woodrow Wilson, international law. Great.
Wonderful. Thank you for that introduction, Chris. And in fact, I would like to specify that I self-identify as Texan. Anybody who is curious. I wouldn't extrapolate too much from that, but it is where I'm from. So today I'm going to be talking about the historical figure of Woodrow Wilson, international law, and the Great War, and looking in particular at a set of ideas that historians of American foreign relations and indeed international history, and even the history of ideas, would group together as Wilsonianism, a particular way of viewing the principles by which the international world should govern itself. So I wanted to begin with a description of the figure, really the monumental proportion that Woodrow Wilson really cast in the First World War. And here we have H.G. Wells in The Shape of Things to Come, describing for a brief interval in which Wilson stood alone for mankind, or at least he seemed to stand for mankind. He ceased to be a common statesman. He became a messiah. Millions believed him as the bringer of untold blessing. Thousands would gladly have died for him. That response was one of the most illuminating events of the early 20th century. Manifestly, the world state had been conceived then, and now it stirred in the womb. It was alive. And then, for some anxious decades, it ceased to stir. So, I'm going to start by describing the background of Woodrow Wilson, how he became the 28th President of the United States, a bit about the ways in which his upbringing shaped his views of the world and the place of international law therein. Then we'll have a brief survey of the American response to the outbreak of the First World War, in particular of the policy of strict neutrality and the paradoxes that Wilson was ultimately incapable of resolving. Then we're going to have a group activity. So I'm going to ask you about your own views of Wilsonianism. Wilson, perhaps most famous for his speech outlining the 14 points. You're all going to have an opportunity to look at these points, to discuss them, and decide which of them you believe to be both the most central to Wilson's vision, and then secondly, what were the most realistic, given what you know about conditions at the end of the First World War. And then finally, we'll discuss the Paris Peace Conference, the Treaty of Versailles, that would issue from it, and then finally, what I think myself and many other historians see as the tragic finale of Wilsonianism in the early 20th century. So, first, a bit about Woodrow Wilson and what I would describe as his ethnocentric humanitarianism. Like many individuals, and especially many leaders, the ideas with which he worked were often somewhat self-contradictory. And one way to try to grasp how Wilson sought to achieve certain ideals in the real world is to look at this interplay between his ethno-nationalism, in fact his Anglophilia, and his sense that there were certain universal humane values that ought to be upheld. So, full name was actually Thomas Woodrow Wilson. He was the first Southerner to serve as President of the United States since the Civil War. He had come to national recognition as the president of Princeton University in the early 1900s, before becoming the governor of New Jersey, and while he was there, taking the state back, in the opinion of many people, from the political bosses who had run it since the late 19th century, what is known as the Gilded Age of corruption in the United States. In 1913, he was elected the 28th President of the United States, and while in office, he would preside over a major expansion of the U.S. government. This is something that Chris spoke to you about with regard to the national security state, but this is also seen as the beginnings of the managerial state in the United States, with the Federal Reserve, Federal Trade Commission, the Clayton Antitrust Act, the first legislation that would permit the breaking up of commercial monopolies, and the first income tax in the United States. So a transformational president, not just in his foreign policy, but also in his domestic policy. Nonetheless, true to his Southern roots and to the Southerners that he placed in positions of power in his government, Wilson was also responsible for segregating the federal workforce, bringing Jim Crow to Washington, D.C. So, how do historians view Wilson? Henry Kissinger, Richard Nixon's National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, himself an historian, himself a thinker about traditions and ideologies in foreign policy, would describe Woodrow Wilson in his presidency as the hinge of American foreign policy. Things would never be the same after Wilson. Why was this? Well, this was because of the vision of international cooperation that Wilson was willing to make himself the champion of. And as a result, he's become the bane of self-declared realists, those who believe that it is in fact the power, the balance of power, and the willingness to see the enemy of my enemy as my friend that are the fundamental maxims driving American foreign policy. He became the bane of realists like Kissinger, like George Kennan, the architect of Cold War containment, by which the United States would marshal its forces to deter the expansion of communist influence after 1947. And I put this up somewhat jokingly, but I think this is probably true of Donald Trump and those who are currently advising him, who see, for instance, the United Nations as in fact playing a marginal and not a central role in contemporary foreign world affairs. Wilson, by contrast, believed that the United States in the world would do well by doing good. You could almost hear an echo of that Silicon Valley mantra in Wilson, but looking not at the private sector, but instead the American federal government and American foreign policy, its diplomatic and military arms to accomplish this humanitarian good. And he very much saw the United States as sitting in the cockpit of modern world history. That the old world of Europe, with its imperial entanglements, with its dynastic competition, needed to seize leadership to the bright new world, the city shining on a hill, as Ronald Reagan would call it, that was more willing to stand up for these universal, ageless values. Now, this being said, despite Wilson's willingness to call European powers to account for their colonies in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, he himself found the United States under his watch dragged into colonial adventures, especially in America's backyard, the Caribbean. The United States, since at least the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, and then the Spanish-American War of 1898, had become the steward of numerous protectorates in the Caribbean. And Wilson, despite his rhetoric, found himself intervening repeatedly in the area. I believe Chris talked about this somewhat, but it's worth repeating, because we see from the very beginning this paradox, this contradiction between Wilson's rhetoric and Wilson's actions. Even though he was seen as the foremost exoriator of imperial privilege, he was also, as the President of the United States, found himself in the position of overseeing his own form of empire. So, with the outbreak of the First World War, the United States found its traditional attitude of neutrality, of isolationism, as historians looking back would describe it, but especially standing apart from the affairs of the old world. This goes back at least to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, this idea that the United States would be the steward of affairs on the Western Hemisphere, and it would leave the old world's struggles to the old world. Well, this was tested like never before in the First World War. Wilson, sensing, I think himself, very, very hesitant to intervene in the First World War, to pick a side, but also sensing the mood of the American people that was deeply anti-war at the beginning of the conflict, declares that we have to be neutral. Neutral in fact as well as name, impartial in thought as well as in action. And part of the reason for this is because of the multinational, multilingual, multicultural tapestry that is the United States in the early 20th century. A nation of immigrants, especially after surges of migration from Italy and Ireland in the later half of the 19th century, had very much changed the complexion of the major East Coast metropolises like New York. Right? And so Wilson, sensing perhaps the possibility that the nation could really come apart, that you could see almost a kind of civil war that would mirror the war, the Great War in Europe, sees that we have to be neutral, since otherwise our mixed populations would wage war on each other. And I think there's also lurking beneath this a certain ethnocentrism, a certain distrust, especially of recent immigrants, Catholic immigrants from Ireland and from Italy. Now, the problem with this is that strict neutrality in practice was not very strict. And the United States, for reasons that were beyond really the grasp of Woodrow Wilson, finds itself leaning to one side. Why is this? Because the United States traditionally had been a real proponent of free trade, at least since the struggles over China's integration into the global economy in the late 19th and early 20th century. And Woodrow Wilson himself was a strong proponent of free trade and of freedom of navigation on the seas. What was more, the United States at this time is a debtor nation. This means that it owes a lot of money to European banks, and those banks are going to insist on being repaid even though there's a war on. If the United States cannot trade as a major exporter of newly industrialized, of cheap textiles, of cheaper industrial manufacturers as well, if they can't trade with Europe, they're not going to be able to pay their debts. So Wilson and the nation finds itself in a catch-22. It has to continue trading with both sides. And yet, because of the impermeability of the British blockade and the British decisive dominance on the high seas, it almost inevitably leans towards the allied powers of Britain and France. So at the beginning of the conflict, the United States is doing almost $1 billion in 1917 dollars. These days, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of trade with Europe. And without it, the economy would sink into a new Great Depression. So there are a number of ways in which the Wilson government tries to navigate these currents. It states that they will not loan money to either belligerent, but ultimately this comes unraveled as cutting off the flow of dollars either way across the Atlantic has severe economic implications. And so first they began giving credits, then they permit loans once more, and it's almost entirely the Allied powers, France and Britain, that are able to take advantage of this and thus finance their war effort as things are becoming increasingly bleak on the Western Front. And then again, I think overhanging all of this is Wilson's own Anglophilia. He had studied in the United Kingdom. It was the only country that he had visited in his lifetime. He had made his academic reputation arguing that the British form of parliament was superior to the American form of government. And so even in his intellectual background, there was a real deep well of affinity and admiration for the British. Now, what proves the straw that breaks the camel's back is the U-boat problem. This technological innovation that the Germans in particular would take advantage of in order to try to strangle the British Isles. Their own form of blockade. Since they couldn't match the British on the waves, they would go under them in order to interdict and destroy cargo vessels. The problem with this is, like many new forms of technology, it raises important questions about distinction. How do you distinguish between a civilian vessel carrying necessary food or commodities, products, versus a military vessel that is thus subject to destruction legally under the laws of naval warfare? And this is a particularly potent problem for the United States because it insists on maintaining its neutrality while still trading with both sides during the war, to the chagrin of both sides. The British aren't very happy about this either. They want the United States to pick a side. And the Germans aren't happy because they're at a decisive disadvantage, and in many ways the United States is financing their adversaries. Now, this gradually, over the course of 3 years, comes to a head, and also plays a really important role, and I think Chris probably spoke to this, in tilting American opinion towards entry into the war, where before it had been strongly anti-war. This begins with the British freighter, the Falaba. When it's sunk, Wilson responds that this is an unquestionable violation of the just rules of international law with regard to unarmed vessels at sea. This truly becomes a major crisis when the Lusitania is sunk. 1,200 civilians lose their lives, including 94 children, 35 of whom were infants or younger. This is, truly a humanitarian catastrophe, and 128 of these 1,200 are American citizens. And so there has to be a response from the United States. But nonetheless, Wilson finds himself in a bind. He wants to excoriate the Germans and to push them to stop unrestricted submarine warfare, while at the same time he has no appetite for entering the war, especially with the presidential election and midterms looming. So, what happens? The Germans agree to cease unrestricted submarine warfare, but this is very much a strategic catastrophe for them. Their one means of responding to the British blockade are the U-boats, and without an ability to use their one strategic naval advantage, they really find themselves at a loss. And so eventually they find themselves drugged towards violating Wilson's red line. So in 1916, the Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, resigns as Wilson begins to tilt towards the British. The British were themselves guilty in various ways of interceding, or at the very least interfering with American freedom of navigation and with their right to trade with either belligerent. They issue sanctions on 80 U.S. businesses for trading with the Central Powers. And it's somewhat funny, you can see almost, again, this foreshadowing of, say, U.S. sanctions against businesses that would trade with North Korea, for instance. In this case, it's the United States playing the part of North Korea, the rogue nation. But again, the U.S. is too financially entangled with the British to really extricate themselves. At the time, U.S. bankers are financing the United Kingdom to the tune of $10 million a day, which in current dollars, a century later, would probably be closer to 200 million, if I had to guess. Wilson slowly begins to mobilize for war, partly in response to voices from his right, in particular Theodore Roosevelt, who are banging the drums for a U.S. Intervention on the side of the Allied powers, but also I think because he sees no good way out of this bind of how to deal with German U-boat warfare. Okay, so this brings us to our group activity. As Wilson begins to find ways of explaining and justifying what he sees as an almost inevitable intervention to the American people, he gives perhaps his most famous speech before the U.S. Congress, which you might describe as his peace without victory speech. Now, this speech serves dual purposes. The first is to prepare Americans for the idea that strict neutrality was going to come to an end, that eventually the United States could not shirk its global responsibilities, could not refrain from the global leadership that was being forced upon it in many ways by its economic and financial interests. But it also was an opportunity for Wilson to lay out his vision of the world order that should replace the imperial great power system that had failed so spectacularly once Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Serbia. So he describes a peace that would not have losers. Victory would mean peace forced upon the loser, a victor's terms imposed upon the vanquished. It would be accepted in humiliation, under duress, and at an intolerable sacrifice, and would leave a sting, a resentment, a bitter memory upon which terms of peace would rest. Not permanently, but only as upon quicksand. Only a peace between equals can last. And this is, in many ways, reaching out to the Kaiser and to the Central Powers that if they were willing to allow the United States to arbitrate, to mediate this conflict, to bring it to a conference table in order to decide the terms of peace, not upon the battlefield, not at Verdun of the Somme, but instead in the quiet confines of a conference room, that there might be a way out of this conflict. Unfortunately, the Europeans, with the bit in their mouth, reject it roundly and, in Wilson's eyes, somewhat egregiously. David Lloyd George responds that yes, the British could foresee American mediation, but only on terms that would be unacceptable to the Kaiser. The Germans state that they're willing to present their terms at a general conference to which Woodrow Wilson would not be invited. Right? So there's a real sense of this upstart American telling the Europeans what they should do when they've already lost the flower of their youth, millions upon entrenched warfare on the battlefield. In January, so only 1 week after Wilson gives this speech, the Germans recommence unrestricted submarine warfare. And then, as Chris, I believe, went into, the Zimmerman revelations 1 month later. So this 1-2 punch is what finally brings the United States into the fray, into the First World War, with Wilson declaring, and this is important, I think, declaring war as an associated power, not as an ally, but as an associated power that would retain its own military command and would approach peace negotiations very much from the standpoint of this peace without victory. So what does peace without victory look like? And this is where Wilsonianism as an ideology, Wilsonianism as an alternative, and I know this is too small, I've got handouts to pass out to everybody, so I'll have Chris do that. Wilson specifies 14 points that he sees as indispensable for one, a peace that would end and not result in another war within 20 years, but also a peace that can create the foundation for long-lasting peace and justice in international affairs, that would knit the countries of the world together in ways that would be responsive to popular sovereignty, responsive to this new upsurge in nationalism around the world, and lastly, that would create forums for arbitration, for conciliation, and ultimately for collective security under something looking like, harkening back here to H.G. Wells, a world state. So, for this activity, if you can find a partner or 2 or 3 of you, I'm going to ask 2 questions here, and I'll give you a little bit of time to read these 14 points. It'll probably take 5 minutes. Wilson was nothing if not rigorous and detailed. And I would like you to pick the 3 out of these 14 points that you believe were most important to Wilson. What looked to you to be the 3 most important components of Wilson's view of international relations? So do that with a partner. But after you've chosen those 3, which 3 do you think were the most realistic? So, which were the most important for Wilson, and then which were the most realistic? Which were the most achievable in 1919, keeping in mind French and British, and indeed German grievances and animosity that resulted in the deaths of millions of young men? Okay, so I'll give us about maybe 10 minutes for that, and then I'll wrap up with a bit about the international, the global response to Wilsonianism.